Hey, I'm Markia, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Welcome, veteran listeners and first-time people that are stopping by. This is my first time, too, so welcome to us all. The things that you'll hear on the Something Scary podcast is a variety of things, including scary stories, occult myth, urban horror, and so much more. But for this week, our topic is change. So first, we'll take a swim after dark in a deserted lake the day before high school starts. After that, we'll have a late night run-in with the lady in white in our new apartment. And finally, we'll tag along with the lonely new kid at school. So,
want to hear something scary?
Our first chapter was submitted by Lumi and takes place in a small village in North Macedonia. It was the last day of summer, and my two best friends, Grace and Lacey, were headed to the lake to go for a swim and cool off. They came to collect me at my house, but before I could grab my swimsuit and towel, my mom came and shut the door on my friends' faces. "No," she said firmly. She was very strict. I was often scared of her. "But it's the last day of summer. If something happens to you out there, you think your weak friends can save you?" she interjected. "You are not a strong swimmer, and your friends are terrible. The lake is absolutely off limits." I knew there'd be no convincing her. I was usually a very obedient kid, albeit out of fear, but damn it, it was the last day of summer, before my first year of high school started. To hell with my mom, at least for this one night. So I texted my friends to come meet me outside my house before sundown. My mom usually went to bed early, so I waited for the confirming snores and made my quiet escape. The summer night air was the perfect temperature. As we walked in our little pack, I couldn't help but smile. A perfect night with my best friends before entering a new chapter of our lives. What could be better? We finally got to the lake. By now, the sun had gone down a bit more, but everything was still visible. That sparkling, cool water was calling to me. I immediately disrobed and cannonballed into it. We all giggled. "Oh, shit," Lacey said. "I think I dropped my phone. I'm going to go look for it." "I'll go with you," Grace said. "So you're just going to leave me here all alone to have all the fun?" I yelled out, trying to sound playful, but really just trying to hide my annoyance. Grace turned on one of the electric lanterns we brought. Its glow only lit everything within 4 feet of it or so. Not super helpful, but it did help me feel less alone. "We'll be quick," Grace assured me. Moments later, I was alone in the lake. The only sounds were my arms and feet swishing in the water. I swam a couple of laps before realizing that the sun had now completely disappeared, and my friends weren't back yet. I figured it was time to get out of the water and maybe go look for them. My arms and legs were also starting to get sore. My mom was right. I'm really not that strong of a swimmer. As I made my way back to land, I saw a figure emerge from the path through the trees. "Took you long enough," I called out as I continued forward. But as the figure came closer, it looked like neither Lacey nor Grace, but still familiar. It called out to me. It began calling my name. It was my mom. Crap, 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 crap. I started panicking. I was going to be in so much trouble. Without thinking, I held my breath and submerged myself under the water. I thought that maybe if I hid underneath long enough, she wouldn't see me. Not the greatest plan, but that's what I did. I stayed under the surface for as long as I could. Maybe 30 seconds had passed, and my lungs were starving for air. I brought my head out of the water and inhaled. I could no longer see the light from the lantern because my mom was in the water, right in front of me. But she didn't look mad. She just stared at me with a slight smile. "I'm sorry I snuck out, Mom," I apologize. "Please don't be mad at me." "Why would I be mad, dear?" she said sweetly. She held out her hand. It's time to go home. My body was so tired from swimming all night. I reached out to grab her hand like it was a life raft. As soon as our hands met, her face wrinkled into a scowl. Her skin faded to gray and her teeth grew long and sharp. This was not my mother. My mother was not a monster. I tried to get out of his grip, but it was so strong. It inched its mouth closer and closer to my face. Then there was a loud whack, and its head bounced as if struck from behind. The demon sank into the water, releasing its grip on me in the process. There was Lacey in the water, with her now bloody phone held above her head. She gave me a piggyback ride to the shore, and I collapsed onto the grass. When I snuck back into the house that night, I decided to confess to my mom. She wasn't happy that I woke her up in the middle of the night, but she appreciated my honesty. Then I told her about the entity in the lake that looked and sounded just like her. She looked surprised. And you are still alive? She asked in shock. Then she exhaled deeply. You know that I only tried to protect you. Of course I want you to have fun, but there are horrible secrets about our village that I didn't think you were ready for. But you're grown up now. Maybe it's time. She wrapped her arm around me and planted a wet kiss on my forehead. So, how did you manage to escape the Mother Lake demon? She asked. My friends saved me, I replied with a grin. Huh. Well, maybe they're not that bad after all. Thank you so much, Lumi, for that story. I very much enjoy having a village filled with secrets, and in particular, having a Mother Lake demon involved. Because that's what our parents really want to do, right? They just want the best for us. And sometimes in doing that, they'll protect us in ways that maybe it's better for us to know the truth. So I very much enjoy hearing that theme done in this kind of story. Thank you so much. Our next tale comes from Bridget. This is the time they encountered the lady in white. I was about 6 or 7 at the time. My parents were split up, and I was with my mother and our cat, Luna. We all lived together and had just moved into a new apartment. When you entered, you would be in a little hallway. You would enter the kitchen on the left, and to the right was a bigger hallway that led to my room. In the middle of that hallway was a bathroom that nobody used, since there were 2 bathrooms. Anyways, one night, I was fast asleep in my room, with my door open and the hallway light on, as usual. I was woken up by a knock at the front door. I knew it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, so I didn't get up to answer the door. I figured they would just go away. I tried going back to sleep, but opened my eyes again when I see the hallway light flicker. You know how when you close your eyes, but you can still see light through your eyelids? The switch for that light was on the other end of the hallway, nowhere near me or my mom's room. So I figured it was just a weird surge in our electrical system. I closed my eyes once more. But then I heard the knock again. But this time, it was closer to my door. On the door to the bathroom that no one uses. Now, my cat is in my room when I sleep every night. She was also awoken by this sound. She started hissing towards my bedroom doorway very quietly. I didn't want to see or hear anything else, so I just pulled my blanket over my head and hoped it would just stop on its own. And it did. For those few moments, anyway. Luna was hissing so loudly now that I couldn't hide any longer. I pulled the blanket off my head and reluctantly looked at the hallway. The lights flickered one more time before I saw a lady in a white dress floating in the hallway. She had long black hair that covered her eyes, but I could tell that she was looking towards me, and I could see her lips smiling widely. Luna started hissing even louder at the lady. Then the lady began floating closer. Luna's hisses were now high-pitched screeches. She ran up to the lady just as she was about to enter my room, and she clawed at the apparition chaotically. There must have been something about Luna's frantic behavior that caused the lady in white to disappear and leave me alone. I called Luna over to me and held her close the rest of the night. Years later, long after we'd moved out of the apartment, I told my mom about that night. "You actually saw the lady in white?" she asked in awe. "I thought the landlord was just crazy. She warned me about her before we moved in, but I didn't believe her. And I didn't want to scare you." "Wait, who is the lady in white?" I asked, both scared and curious at the same time. "The landlord thinks it's the spirit of a woman who killed herself in the building a long time ago. A murder-suicide, actually." My mom stopped talking abruptly. "I shouldn't be telling you this. I can handle it. I want to know what happened." I begged my mom to continue. "Well, the landlord said that before she took her own life, she went into her daughter's room and took her life first." We sat in silence. The memory of that night began to replay in my head. If Luna hadn't been there, what would the lady have done to me? I'm glad I never had the chance to find out. It's been years since I saw her, and thankfully I haven't seen her since. Maybe because I still have Luna by my side. How long do cats live? A long time, I pray, for I hope to never be without Luna if the lady in white ever comes back to finish what she started. Wow, Bridget, I'm glad that you and Luna are so close. And, maybe Luna could use some more companions, maybe another cat or another dog. She could teach them the ropes, and you wouldn't ever have to worry about being alone or ever encountering the lady in white again. Either way, I hope that it works out for the best. And now we've reached our final chapter. Our last story comes to us from Ashley. When I first started high school, I was the only new kid. Everyone else already seemed to know one another from junior high, and I didn't have the guts to go up and introduce myself to anyone. Mom was certain that I'd make friends easily with my outgoing personality, and not to mention that my older brother Marty was the quarterback of the school's football team, so I had an almost guaranteed spot with the popular crowd. Well, to hell with that theory, Mom. A couple of weeks went by and no one cared to talk to me. I didn't make a single friend. I was always sitting off to the side in the cafeteria, eating my lunch alone like a loser. There was one day when I tried to sit with my brother and his friends. Before I joined him at the school, we had actually been pretty close. But him and his friends acted like I didn't even exist. I'd say feeling invisible was much worse than getting the shit kicked out of you. At least when you're getting beat up, they acknowledge you're alive, right? Later that evening, I took a shower and brushed my teeth like usual. Then the air suddenly turned frigid, different. I thought maybe my mom turned up the air conditioning, but the house was already cold. I stepped out of the bathroom to call for my mom, but before I could, I heard a loud, repetitive thumping. It's got to be Mom. Marty's at football practice and no one else is here but us, I quietly muttered to myself, but was tempted to go check and see, knowing that wasn't the best idea. I took a flashlight out of my dresser and a knife I kept in my bedroom just in case. Heading downstairs, I crept as quietly as I could into the living room. I flipped the light switch, but the power was out. "Mom?" I called out, but got no response. "Mom, where are you?" I asked again, got nothing back. Thud, thud, thud. The loud banging seemed to now be coming from my bedroom now. "Mom, if this is some kind of prank you're trying to pull against me, it's working, all right? You win. Come out." Thud, 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 thud. I felt like I was about to have a heart attack. I didn't know what I was going to find up there or who, but I had to go see. Going back up the stairwell now, my eyes widened when I saw that my door was now open. I definitely shut it when I came downstairs. I knew there was something or someone in my room. I held the knife in midair and rushed inside. And then my heart sank. On the floor was a body that had my face. It was me. I was a bloody, useless heap on the ground. How was this happening? Just then, I heard the door behind me creak. I spun around, and there was my mother, with a knife, bloody as ever. "That will teach you to get in the way of Marty's future," she whispered, and then slammed the door. The room was pitch black. I was trembling in horror, but I managed to turn on the light. The body, my body, was now gone. In fact, the room was gone. It was now entirely different, filled with old boxes, like my room was for storage. And then I remembered everything. No one was talking to me at school because I was dead. My mother had murdered me. She couldn't afford to put us both through college, and Marty had to attend the best school with the best football team so he could become the rich and famous athlete my mom and he had always wanted. So she stabbed me to death in this room and buried my body in the backyard. It was all coming back to me. How could I have forgotten? Just then, I heard a soft cry. It was coming from down the hallway. I floated over to the sound. Sobs echoed from my brother's room. He was looking at an old picture of me, and I realized he didn't know the truth. I moved towards his ear, not knowing if I could communicate with him, but I still tried. I whispered every detail to him. And suddenly, Marty stopped sobbing. He stood up and walked downstairs with purpose. I followed him to the backyard. He grabbed a shovel and started digging right in the spot I had told him about. There he found my body. Marty broke down in tears again and went back inside to call the police. My mother went to jail, and Marty stayed with our grandparents. He was on track to get a full athletic scholarship for his top choice university. Sure, his reputation was tainted by the stories and rumors that followed, but he never let that get to him. And as for me, I'm not lonely anymore. I keep my big brother company in college, whether he knows it or not. This week's podcast stories were edited by Adam Sinker and Safar Sandalo. Audio editing for this podcast by Fitz Harris. If you have a story you'd like to submit, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. Don't forget to watch the video version of Something Scary over at youtube.com/snarled. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, join our Patreon at patreon.com/snarled. Until next time, sweet dreams. Hello, my dark darlings. I'm Markia, and this is the Something Scary podcast, welcoming veteran listeners and those that are crawling with us for the first time into the deep dark. Fantasy doesn't always stay fiction. Sometimes it creeps into reality, and as we grow older, those childhood fairy tales gain a whole new meaning. First, Sapphire shares a magical tale about a baker with a dark, delectable secret. Next, we'll follow a young occultist into a dangerous swamp. After that, we'll help an injured drifter on the side of the highway. And finally, we'll watch as a children's fairy tale tears a family apart. I receive hundreds of creepy story submissions every single week. As always, the first story you hear is one that I've chosen to animate and post over at youtube.com/snarled. Then, I read a few more stories for the podcast. If you have a tale you're dying to share, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, consider joining our Patreon. Our patrons play a huge role in keeping the show running every single week. For more information on how you can help the show and also be a part of it, visit patreon.com/snarled. So,
Want to hear something scary? The Baker's Inn.
This week's video was sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. Now enjoy an original dark fairy tale inspired by Magic the Gathering, Throne of Eldraine. In the countryside of Ardenvale, on the outskirts of Beckborough, there was a family dairy farm that fell upon desperate times. To save the farm, the father sent his eldest daughter, Gertrude, to sell the family mule at the nearest village. After a half-day's travel, Gertrude arrived in the village of Beckborough. She made her way to the marketplace and began asking around. The merchants waved her off or made joke offers on her mule. It was almost enough for her to give up and go home, until she met a charming man in a feather cap. "That's a good, strong animal you have," the man said. "You deserve a good price for a mule like this." He made Gertrude a generous offer, even more than she expected, and traded her mule for a full bag of silver. Cheerful with her fortune, Gertrude skipped and jangled to a building named the Baker's Inn. She decided she could afford a room for the night before embarking home the next morning. The inn was warm and lively, with customers lined up to purchase dinner pies from the bakery counter. Gertrude reached the counter and she met the welcoming eyes of the baker. She eagerly placed a piece of silver on the counter and requested a pie and room for the night. Smiling, the baker placed the silver on his scale. But at that moment, his smile changed to a frown. He grabbed Gertrude by the wrist. "Where did you get this? You can get in a lot of trouble buying goods with plated counterfeits." Gertrude looked down at her bag of silver, confused, and cold reality settled in. She began to weep. "I didn't know. I thought the silver was real, I swear," she pleaded. "The man in the feather cap tricked me. I sold my family mule to him, and now I can never show my face at home." The baker felt bad for losing his temper. "Oh, you poor child. That is not fair." He handed her a pie from the rack and gave her a table to sit and eat. With cheeks still moist, she ate the pie. It was hot and filled with a delicious, very tender beef filling. It was no wonder the bakery had people lined up earlier. It was evening now, and Gertrude had nowhere she could go. But the baker had a proposition. "Young miss, you saw how busy it got in here today. How would you like to work for me? You can live in the spare room and parcel money home to your family." Gertrude was speechless. She hugged the baker, and after he showed her the room, he explained her duties. She would clean, tend the bakery counter, and prepare the guest rooms. Gertrude would have a chance to save the family farm after all. She fell fast asleep. Later that night, she sprung awake to the sound of blood-curdling screams echoing through the walls of the inn. Was this a nightmare? What could she do? Gertrude clutched the sheets to cover herself and laid scared for a long time. But eventually, the screaming ceased, and she drifted back to sleep. At sunrise, Gertrude came downstairs and welcomed a knight in noble silks with a sword at his hip. When the baker came out of the larder, Gertrude asked if he had heard the unsettling screams the previous night. "Oh, what you heard last night," the baker began ominously, "is the inn's worst kept secret. We have a ghost problem. We're lousy with them, in fact. If I'd known better, I wouldn't have built my bakery in a haunted inn. They're a nuisance, yes, but they're harmless, I promise." This statement prompted laughter from the knight across the room. "Sounds like a hoax. I've seen all there is to see. Witches, fairies, redcaps, and trolls, but never a ghost," he said. "Well, tonight, maybe you will," derided the baker. The baker sent Gertrude to prepare the knight's room, and after a long day of sweeping and selling pies, she sat down to a tasty pie of her own. Later that night, she awoke to more terrible screams. But now, instead of being scared, she was just annoyed. She buried her head in her pillow and filled her mind with positive thoughts. Decadent meat pies, her family, the farm. And with that, she drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Gertrude couldn't wait to ask the knight how he slept. But the knight was nowhere to be found. The baker pulled a fresh rack of pies from the oven. "What happened to the knight?" Gertrude asked the baker. "Oh, him?" the baker said dismissively. "He was summoned to an errand for his lord and took off in the night. Care for a pie?" This answer didn't sit well with Gertrude, and the lack of sleep was beginning to wear on her. The rest of the day, customers came in droves, and she was able to distract herself by selling pies. But night came too soon. To Gertrude's surprise, the inn remained silent. Somehow the silence was more unsettling. What, did the ghost decide to take a day off? She got up and crept over to the guest room where the knight stayed before. There was nothing remarkable. It was just empty. She thought she had seen enough until she noticed an odd seam in the wall. She pulled it open to reveal a secret compartment. There, in a pile, laid a hoard of belongings: silks, swords, shoes, and armor. Every instinct told Gertrude it was time to leave. She rushed quietly down the hall, rounded the corner, and then covered her mouth in shock. The baker blocked the doorway to her room, his back turned. He was looking for her. Gertrude moved decisively in the other direction, down the stairs and towards the exit, until suddenly she heard a man crying for help. Risking escape and safety, she followed the cries over to the larder. Inside, Gertrude saw sacks of flour, a bloody butcher's block, and a pile of human skulls. She gagged, now horrified by her new understanding: the pie's secret ingredient. Gertrude found the man who was crying out and immediately began to untie him, and then stopped. There was now a knife held up to her face. It was the baker. "Do you remember this man?" asked the baker. Gertrude glanced at the tied-up man and had a shock of recognition. "Yes," said the baker. "It's the man with the feather cap who humiliated you. And now he's here, at your mercy." She recoiled at the baker's sinister invitation. "Even if he hurt me, nobody deserves this." "I see," said the baker. "But if you let him go, I'll still need meat from someone to make the pies. I can't keep up with demand, you see. It's either him or you." A week later, Gertrude's family began receiving parcels of silver delivered by messenger once per week. Over time, the farm began to flourish again and was doing better than ever. "I miss seeing Gertrude," Father said, "but because of all her hard work, the farm is safe. I just hope she's happy wherever she is." And to this day, they say you can get the tastiest pies in all of Ardenvale if you visit a little haunted inn run by a baker and his assistant. But whatever you do, don't stay for the night.
For those aspiring witches whose curiosity led them to something truly horrifying, this next story, inspired by Caliban, might be right up your alley. My name is Caliban. I grew up in the backwoods of Maine in a town called Wyndham. The land was green and fertile, but only for trees, weeds, and grass. Flowers, not so much. Hardly anything pretty sprang up in those hills. However, far behind our tree line was a misty bog. I'd always been interested in exploring the place. I read online that this swamp could grant wishes to those who'd brave its grounds. I wanted so much for that fantasy to be real, so I planned to enter the area. But I knew my parents wouldn't allow me, so I snuck out of my house during the day. I made sure to bring some salt from the kitchen. The internet said it could ward off evil. Who was I to argue? I stayed as well on the trail as I possibly could. The last thing I wanted was to get turned around this far from civilization. As I entered the swamp, I started to smell something foul. Something like a busted sewer pipe in the middle of the muck. My hair began to stand on end, not from disgust, but from fear. The smell, the tension in the air. I've read enough nature guides to know that I just stumbled into a predator's domain. Then I heard the sounds. Groaning, snapping, and that earthly rumble that lets anyone from Yankee country know for a fact that a tree had just fallen. But I didn't hear an axe swinging away or a chainsaw powering through the trunk. Then it happened again. Snapping, groaning, with the terrifying crash of fallen lumber. And then a new noise joined the symphony. A snarl that turned into a roar. Not from some fur-covered creature. This roar sounded entirely new. Another tree came down, and this time it was close enough that I felt the ground under my feet rumble. And as I turned in the opposite direction to run for my life, the leaves around me spun like a dust devil. Tiny voices called to me.
Don't go away. Our master will be here soon.
He just wants to introduce himself. He's not so beastly once he's played with you. I immediately knew there weren't any bodies to these voices, as if the sound came from the swamp itself. As I bolted back along the path, I noticed rabbits quickly running into their warrens, ducks taking to the sky and soaring to safety. It began to dawn on me that I was not the only one who sensed danger coming up through the bog. I paused to catch my breath and to look behind me, if only for a moment. What I saw will never leave my mind. Slowly, looping around the corner, was a shaggy-haired, needle-nosed, blotchy-skinned troll. His teeth were coated with dirty green moss, infested with insects. His arms looked like decaying tree branches, mangled with woodpecker marks, and his eyes were a shade of white that seemed to peer right into my very soul. I didn't take another look behind me. I didn't scream or yell in fear. I pumped my legs and arms as fast as I could manage in the opposite direction. Trolls were myths. Trolls weren't supposed to exist. Trolls were Irish nonsense not even Mom believed in, and she was Irish to the bone. I ran to the base of the swamp, leading back up to my house. I reached into my pocket, searching for something to stop the troll. In between my fingers, I felt the salt shaker. Remembering that salt could ward off evil creatures, I stopped at the tree line and dumped half of the salt to shape a barrier. I smiled and caught my breath. But just then, leaves picked up. A massive swell of wind broke the salt pile, sending the stuff right into my eyes. I fell to the floor and rubbed my face in pain. Tears broke out as I strained myself to look forward again. The voices were back.
Let him play with you.
Let him see you. Let him taste you. As my vision returned, there was the massive troll staring right at me, mouth wide open. The smashed remains of various animals hanging from his mossy green teeth. I screamed, and with all my might, I tossed in the rest of the salt shaker into its mouth. The troll froze. I didn't know what to do. But then it began to taste the salt. The troll started choking and trembling against the trees. It put its full weight against one of the old saplings and sent it falling towards me. I rolled out of the way as it smashed right into the muck beside me. The dust was kicked up again as thunderous stomps echoed further and further into the bog. Suddenly, a loud, painful roar shot out through the swamp, and a final smash signaled the fall of the beast. The crows and magpies around me cawed loudly and flew away from the area. Did it work? Was that thing gone? The ducks and rabbits ran back into their home. I smiled. Things were safe now. I went in there wishing for magic, and it was granted. Fantasy had become reality. Trolls were real, and they were in my own backyard. If you don't believe me, do yourself a favor. Take a walk through the bog when the sun begins to set. Listen to your feet crunching over twigs and feel for the wind change. If you hear the voices of the swamp urging you to meet their master, then you'll know you've made it into the troll's nest. Just don't forget your salt, or you'll become its next meal. Thank you so much, Caliban, for this story. I actually didn't know how to stop a troll before now. I honestly don't think I would know what to do. I mean, how else could you stop a troll? It's huge, powerful, this mythical creature made into real flesh. The thing that really creeped me out, though, were the voices in the swamp. Because the way that they sounded, they could sound a whole lot like the voices in your own head, just echoing back. I wonder if there are any other creatures that are weak against salt. I hope you could tell us, Caliban. I honestly don't have any idea. Would you stop and help a stranger in the woods? Well, this story, inspired by a submission from Clint, might make you think twice about lending a helping hand. The name is Clint. I live on a 5-acre plot in the rural area of Jasper County near Arunago, Missouri. I used to be an officer on the force here in Jasper, but have recently retired. I do miss helping the people around Jasper, but it was nice to take a much-needed break. Most of the days, I'd hike along the highway, waving at the occasional car. One day, I was walking on State Highway 43, heading for North Fork Creek, when I heard something from a nearby stand of trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal, screeching in the thicket. But some of these sounded guttural, like they were coming from a person in trouble. I heard a voice scream, "Help!" My police instincts kicked in, and I ran into the trees to help the man. As I cleared the bushes, I saw him. He was leaning against a tree, hidden beneath the dark shade. His body looked malformed, but strong as hell. His legs seemed busted up pretty bad. And strangest of all, he looked like he was covered in something dark, head to toe. The man froze as he saw me entering through the trees. He limped out of the shade. I saw him clearer now. He looked tore up bad. All he had on were his pants and the tatters of a work coat. "You all right?" I asked. He sputtered at me, blood dripping heavily from his mouth. "A car flew right by me, hit me into the trees." Just then, he doubled onto the ground. I thought he might puke, but instead he started coughing up hair. Large tufts of black hair dropping out of his bloody teeth. I quickly took his shoulder. "Listen, bud, I got a place in Jasper. How about we get you there and patch you up?" He finished his coughing and peered up at me in desperation. "Near the forest?" I smiled and pat him on the back. "Can't escape it around here." The humor seemed to breathe some light into him, and we drove back to my place. His name was Warren, and he was touring Missouri. just a fan of the sights like me. But he was strolling the highway when some asshole in a semi smashed into him. Thankfully, it seemed to only catch his leg, so he would be all right. We should probably call the police and catch that car, I insisted. No, we don't need to get them involved, Warren said. I don't want to spend my vacation huddled in some police station. I dressed all his wounds once we got back to my home. Most of it was just cuts and bruises, so it didn't take long to help him out. For his leg, I had to give him an old crutch. Warren seemed to be a pretty tough guy, and his physique matched. Still, physique doesn't count for much with a truck coming your way. I gave Warren some new clothes and let him rest on my couch for now. It had gotten dark, so I decided to give the sheriff a ring. I felt I had to file a report. Old habit, really. The sheriff seemed shaken when I described the incident.
That's strange. That truck driver just drove into our lot. We're trying to wipe all the blood off his hood,
he said. Well, that's great. So you arrested him, I asked. There was a long pause.
He said he didn't hit a person. He hit an animal. It was moving fast across the road and struck his car. There's claw marks on the tires and the dents match.
He tried to keep his composure, but I could tell he was worried.
Keep that man on your couch. I'll be right down.
The sheriff hung up in a hurry. Not knowing what to do, I silently made my way back into the living room to check on Warren. But the couch was empty, and the nearby sliding door to the backyard forest was wide open. I slowly crept up to the door and peered outside. There was Warren, his back facing me, his front staring right into the dark hallway of trees. Warren stood motionless. My porch lights barely caught him in the night. Warren crouched down and started to tremble. Suddenly, he shot up from his position, clothes ripping and masses of flesh and fur breaking through his body. His spine and torso twisted into a brute-like shape. His feet grew long and his nails grew thick. Warren craned his narrow face up to the full moon and howled a horrible sound. He spun around to find me staring at him from across the yard, his menacing snout twisted into a sharp grin. Warren started stomping his way towards me, his black fur shining bright as he moved into the light. Warren crouched down, ready to pounce, but stopped. A sharp noise cut through his vicious breathing. It was the sound of a siren. The sheriff's cruiser burst through the trees and cut across my backyard. The sheriff busted out of his door, raised his rifle, and fired. The bullet ripped through the cold air and flung Warren back into a tree. And after several moments, Warren did not get back up. The sheriff then turned to me. A bandolier of glistening silver bullets sat strapped to his vest. With the red and blue flashes from his cruiser, he walked up to me and grunted. I think we might need you back after all, Clint. So now I'm back on the force, helping the people of Jasper County, but in a whole different way. I advise anyone listening to this, if you take a walk in the woods, don't trust who you meet in there, because you might not make it out alive. I really wonder what happened to Clint after this story was done. This sounds like this was his first encounter with the supernatural, with the mythical. And to have this be this amazing creature be the first one. You know, something that my mother likes to say is that we attract the things that we can handle. And the fact that Clint could handle, well, I'm going to just go ahead and say it, a werewolf, that says a lot about him. Would you take an injured stranger into your home, I wonder? I mean, that seems like one of those things that we can't really answer until they're standing right there, asking us for help. I think that I would. Would you? Sometimes the spooky stories we're told as children can follow us into adulthood. This story, inspired by Teresa, is proof. We lived in the Filipino province of Bukidnon. Growing up without a father was difficult. It was me, my younger sister Diane, my mother, and my 2 grandparents. Our father died when Diane was born, so our Lolo took over as a fatherly role model for us. Something we both loved to do, however, was revel in Filipino myths. Lolo told us tons of Filipino legends, and at such a young age, we ate them right up. We grew up to believe in all the fantastical creatures from his stories. But as we got older, we never really dropped the belief. Sure, they were just stories, but we were still cautious about some of the creatures that really frightened us. One of which were the Encanto, or what you might refer to them as elves. Now, these elves aren't the cheerful type from your childhood stories with pointy ears and magic wands. Encanto are much more powerful. They appear more human-like, except for their unnaturally high-bridged noses, extremely fair skin, and golden glowing hair. These elves had enormous power. If you didn't respect them, they could possess your mind and drive you to insanity, or make you lose your way, causing victims to disappear from their life forever. It's true that some Encanto could bring luck, but the true horror came from the fact that they had the power to do wrong and the choice to as well. And oftentimes it was the latter. Encanto lived in baleti trees. And wouldn't you know it, we had a baleti tree right outside our very house. As kids, this story scared us to death, and my Lolo was proud of it. He warned us that since the Encanto preyed upon women, we were never allowed to date. As kids, we swore celibacy and left little offerings of candy to appease the Encanto. But as we grew older, our superstitions went away. We left the baleti tree alone, and we started dating people. Diane was crazy about one boy in particular. His name was Gabriel, and my sister would spend all day with him. She was barely home, and over time we noticed that she had become more sluggish. We thought it was because she was staying up every night talking to Gabriel, but she was still fatigued in and out of the house. One morning, she completely collapsed in the living room. My Lolo noticed the symptoms right away and called a local arbolario to our place. An arbolario was like a witch doctor or a healer for those afflicted with otherworldly qualms. When the arbolario visited our house, she brought Diane back to her senses with some herbs and immediately began asking her questions. Who are you talking to in the middle of the night? Gabriel from the trees, my sister muttered. She never mentioned the trees part before. We all became worried. The arbolario continued. What does Gabriel want from you? Diane coughed. To join him. The arbolario struck her hand on the sofa in rage. She turned to us, gritting her teeth like a doctor who lost a patient. An Encanto has marked your dear Diane. It seems to already have her mind. We were all shocked when we heard this. There was no skepticism in the room. We all believed it, and we had to know what to do next. Is there anything we could do to prevent this? My mother asked in tears. The arbolario merely stood up from her seat and gathered her things. Pray, she muttered as she left our home. No one slept that night, not even Diane. She was in and out of consciousness, moaning in pain. The longer she was away from the baleti tree, the more she complained. She would always try to get up, but my mother would hold her down until we could plan something. Me and my Lolo drove to nearby markets, buying up all the candy we could. He was silent the entire ride home. I could tell he felt guilty. I'm sure we were all having fun back then, sharing stories about myths and legends. But this was real. This was actually happening. An Encanto had my sister, and we couldn't get her out of it. I went outside alone and threw down the candy at the balletti tree, tears streaming down my face. "Give her back! Give her back!" I screamed, but nothing worked. I shouted so loud that a neighbor came to see if I was all right. As I smirked, I turned to my neighbor, whose pale lips were smirking right back, encircled by golden glowing hair and a high-bridged nose mocking me in the moonlight. It was Gabriel. I clenched my fists in fury. This was the thing that was stealing my sister away, the Encanto. "I want her back," I said plainly. His smirk turned into a wide grin.
You really want her back? A shame. Her pain amuses me. And where can I find a replacement for a grieving family?
I gritted my teeth, marching towards him. "I won't ask again." His lips drew thin, but his smile remained.
You might not like how you get her back.
It was too much. I couldn't take it. I rushed towards Gabriel and tackled him to the ground. With all my fury, I took my palms and clenched them tight around his throat. I shook his head around while squeezing his trachea. "Give her back! Give her back! Give her back!" I squeezed so hard I thought I was going to break my hands. Gabriel kept staring back at me with a smile on his face. His fair skin grew dark and red as I forced all my might to crush his windpipe. And suddenly, his face transformed from a look of pride to a look of horror. His eyes shot open wide and tears sprung from his face. "Please, stop, Teresa," he sputtered out in pain. I screamed and tightened my thumbs. I could feel the breath leaving his body. Gabriel convulsed and kicked. He pleaded in tears until finally he stopped moving. I slowly took my hands off his broken neck. I closed my eyes and craned my head up, letting the cool air pass from the balletti tree. And then I opened my eyes, but the moon was replaced by our ceiling fan. The temperature rose. I wasn't outside anymore. I was in my living room. My breath grew short. I felt the horror. I knew the truth. I was on the couch, on top of my sister. I slowly craned my head below me to find the frightened face of my dear sister, killed by my own hands, tears still fresh in her eyes, just like mine, and a look of betrayal staring right back up at me. The Encanto hadn't driven her to madness. It drove me. The light flickered on as my mother and grandparents gasped at what I had done. In the end, Gabriel had lost his victim, but he kept his grieving family. Wow, I am so sorry that this happened to you, Teresa. Everything about this, the Encanto in particular, I would like to think that there are good Encanto and bad ones, especially if they're ones that could bring you luck. And just like with humans, we have the choice to do good or to not. And I'm so sorry for this tragic event that happened in your life. It makes me wonder if there's anything that we could have done to save Diane. It seemed like the Encanto had her in his sights no matter what. One thing that I definitely believe, though, is that I am glad that their Lolo did teach them about these creatures, because could you imagine not knowing what to do at all? It's always better to be aware, even if that leads to an ending like this. This week's podcast stories were edited by Adam Sinker and Sapphire Sandalo. Audio editing for this podcast by Fitz Harris. If you have a story you'd like to submit, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. Don't forget to watch the video version of Something Scary over at youtube.com/snarled. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, join our Patreon at patreon.com/snarled. Until next time, my dark darlings, sweet dreams. Hello, my dark darlings. I'm Arkia, and this is the Something Scary podcast. To our veteran listeners and those voyaging into the dark with us for the first time, welcome. It's comforting to imagine killers behind bars, but what if they get loose? Some could be stalking around your neighborhood, or even be that dark shadow outside your window. Today's stories all talk about killers close to home. First, we'll watch some live coverage of a murderer gone loose. Next, we'll order some odd-tasting ice cream from a disgruntled employee. After that, we'll take a dip in the pool at a roadside bed and breakfast. And finally, we'll visit a small town and get in deep with some bad kids. I receive hundreds of creepy story submissions every single week. As always, the first story you hear is one that we've chosen to animate and post over at youtube.com/snarled. Then, I read a few more stories for the podcast. If you have a tale you're dying to share, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. And if you'd like to support the show and receive bonus content, consider joining our Patreon. Our patrons play a huge role in keeping the show running every single week. For more information on how you can help the show and also be a part of it, visit patreon.com/snarled. So, want to hear something scary? The Midnight News. The following story is inspired by Charlotte. My neighborhood had always felt very safe. Our neighbors knew each other, and the only crimes ever reported were things like stolen bikes or car break-ins, and those were rare. As I walked home from school that day, it never crossed my mind that anything bad could happen. I got home and started my homework at the kitchen table while my mom was making dinner. The local news was on, which was perfect for background noise, because the news in our town was always boring. But today, the newscasters caught my ear. A man known for committing a spree of brutal killings in our town 3 decades ago had just escaped from prison. I'd heard his name before, the Grim Gouger. They showed security footage of the escape as they were giving his description. Tall, heavyset, wearing a white mask. They said he was mentally unstable and armed with knives he'd stolen from the kitchen during the escape. And from the bloody shoe tracks he left behind, it looked like he'd already used them. My mom saw the fear on my face just as the newscaster started to tell how the Grim Gouger got his name. She turned off the TV. The news loves to scare people, she said. But if you don't see it, it isn't happening. See? My mom went back to cooking. I tried to focus on my homework, but it wasn't easy. The Grim Gouger was loose. That night, my dad was running late, so we started dinner without him. My mom told some pretty funny jokes, and for a moment, everything was fine. We were totally safe. The news really was just about scaring people. But when my dad arrived home, I could tell something was way off. He went straight to my mom and whispered in her ear. She then turned to me and said, "Straight to bed, young lady." I got up from the table, and as I did, I could just make out the slight buzz of a helicopter outside. As I settled in for bed, I could hear the sound of the helicopter grow louder, along with a high-pitched whine of sirens. Meanwhile, downstairs, my parents were frantically checking that all the doors and windows were locked while speaking in hushed tones. "I'll stay up," my dad whispered. My mom agreed to stay up with him. My parents had never acted like this before, ever. This was serious. I grabbed my iPad and logged into the local news. Live camera footage from a helicopter was searching a suburban neighborhood. A huge manhunt was underway. I closed my eyes and repeated my mom's words in my head. If you don't see it, it isn't happening. I turned off the iPad and pulled up the covers. Another restless hour passed. I just drifted off to sleep when a loud buzzing rattled the whole house and sent my heart racing. I grabbed my iPad and quickly logged back in to find the live footage of the manhunt still streaming. The helicopter spotlight drifted over a 2-story townhouse that looked all too familiar. The Rosens. They lived just 3 houses away. As I watched the Rosens' house all lit up in the spotlight, a man in black clothing darted around the corner out of sight. Mom? Dad? I called out, but they were either asleep or they couldn't hear me over that chopper engine which had turned insanely loud. Suddenly, the spotlight swung across my bedroom window with this blinding white light, and that's when I saw our house on live TV. There was our patio, our grill, and the trees tossing wildly under the helicopter's swirling blades. I stared hard at the iPad screen when someone darted off the side of our house. I couldn't believe my eyes. This can't be real, I thought. I turned off the iPad and closed my eyes. And as soon as I did, the helicopter drifted away. My mom was right. She had to be. If you don't see it, it isn't happening. Then a smash of broken glass came from downstairs, followed by the screams of my mom and dad. I ran down the steps, trying to keep my feet quiet, and peeked into the kitchen. There were my mom and dad tied to chairs. Both their eyes were gone, leaving empty sockets, as I realized how the Grim Gouger got his name. I covered my mouth, but a small cry escaped. The Grim Gouger turned and looked at me through his white mask.
It's okay. If you don't see it, it isn't happening.
He walked toward me, repeating,
If you don't see it, it isn't happening.
Those who come running at the familiar jingle of the ice cream truck might want to walk a bit more slowly after listening to this story. Inspired by Alex. If there's one thing that gets kids excited, it's that familiar jingle of the ice cream truck. Who didn't run out with their allowance at the sound of that song? I definitely did. I loved talking with the neighborhood kids as we ate our treats on a hot summer day. The best part was, we knew the driver. Larry and Leo, a father and son duo. Leo was my age and we all thought he was so cool. I mean, he got to work in an ice cream truck for Christ's sake. But as we all grew older, so did Leo. Now we were all 17 and Leo no longer enjoyed helping his dad. Now he called it a dead-end job. He wanted to get out there and be somebody, but his dad made him work the truck. The worst of it came when old Larry decided to double profits. He left to work the town over, leaving Leo to handle our neighborhood. Everyone could tell Leo was over it now. He started raising his prices without even telling his dad. That way it looked like he sold more ice cream without doing much work. I still took my nephews to get ice cream, so I would see him from time to time. He grew his hair out and adopted a bad attitude. He'd make fun of the kids and give them less than they asked for. I asked him about it one day. Hey, you know these kids are just as excited as we were back then. Cut them some slack. This seemed to really get under Leo's skin.
Just wait until they grow up. Then they'll realize how trapped they are in this shitty little town.
I just rolled my eyes and bought my nephew some strawberry sherbet. We went back home and I thought about Leo. He had stopped showing up at school. He just stayed shacked up in that van, waiting for his dad to come home. I figured maybe he was lonely and needed someone to talk to, but my train of thought was cut short by my nephew.
Uncle Alex?
He winced and started grasping his stomach. I stood up. Something was very wrong. Hey, what is it, bud? Tearing up, he gasped.
I don't feel very
Crying, he dropped his cone and started vomiting pink ice cream on the kitchen floor. I helped him get a bucket. That damn ice cream. I inspected the cone. It had hair all over it. And there were weird yellow flakes in the ice cream. I took a whiff of it and reeled back. It smelled awful.
Leo said this was the only ice cream we deserved.
My nephew croaked out. This is absolutely unacceptable. You need to tell me next time Leo tries any of this, I responded. I decided I was going to confront Leo right now. I found his truck parked outside the local grocery. I also noticed that the truck door was ajar. I took the opportunity and went inside. The truck was freezing cold. No surprise there. I checked the trash can inside the truck, and there was the hairnet. Of course he wasn't using it, but something else caught my eye. Underneath the trash can was a crate. I lifted the lid, and there in front of me sat bundles of cash and a map of the state. He was planning to run off with all this money he hoarded. I couldn't believe it. Leo was going to betray his father. I looked around for more places he was hiding money. In the corner sat the freezer. More must be in there. I took the lid and threw it open. But there was no money inside. Rather, there were mounds and mounds of strawberry sherbet ice cream. And implanted in the center was the decapitated head of old Larry. I couldn't move. I'd never seen a dead body in my life. The face I had known so well as a kid now stared back at me with a look frozen in horror. The ice cream began to fall apart, revealing more pieces of Larry's body. Blood leaked throughout the sherbet, the same sherbet all the children were eating. The door slammed behind me. I spun around, and there stood Leo, a bag of ice in one hand and a chef's knife in the other. Are you here to stop me too? He grumbled under his breath. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Well, why? How did you? He left the knives lying all over the truck. Never really saw it coming, but you seem to be ready for it. Leo started moving forward. My hand searched for a weapon, but instead found the button for the ice cream jingle. I pressed it and jumped through the big open serving window. Leo cursed. You little rat! Get back here before I... But he stopped. All the nearby kids and their parents came running up to the ice cream truck, including some local police stopping by for a smoothie. The rest went by in a blur, but I remember pulling the cops over to the side, warning them not to sip their smoothies, and the next thing I knew, Leo was in handcuffs, being sent away in a car, playing a much different type of song. We had a funeral for old Larry. Almost every kid in the neighborhood came out for that one. And as for me, well, there is an open invitation for a new ice cream driver. So I thought I'd make amends. I want every kid to smile when they hear that familiar jingle again. And this time, everyone gets a free scoop. Who doesn't have an ice cream truck in their neighborhood? I mean, do you still have that? I know that I definitely do. I can't remember not having that. And I also couldn't think about having that friendly ice cream truck driver turn into somebody like Leo. Do you think our storyteller was right for entering that truck alone? I mean, he was pretty riled up. I mean, I know I would have done it. Do you think you'd ever work in an ice cream truck? I hope you don't turn out like Leo. Family vacations can often get cut short, but never quite like this next story, inspired by this anonymous submitter. Every summer, me and my family would drive down through the desert to Las Vegas. This had basically become tradition. While my parents would spend their money in the casinos, I would basically chill out in the hotel pool. We didn't have a pool back home, so I was always really excited to jump in the water. However, today's drive to Las Vegas wasn't going well. We left late in the day and got stuck in traffic. It was awful. The worst part about these trips was the drive, and this one was taking forever. My dad tried to distract me by turning on the radio, which never worked. The songs cycled through generic top 40 hits until suddenly the feed cut out. Some static played and then a news reporter came on.
The Clark County Juvenile Detention Center has suffered a breach in security. Young inmate Abigail Foster is the only known escapee. She was incarcerated last year for the murder of her parents. She is known to hide her identity with a paper mask. Please lock your doors and report any suspicious behavior to local law enforcement.
My mom and dad sat in silence. That was all a joke, right? I looked out my window to catch a sign reading, "Now entering Clark County." My dad smiled and pointed to a familiar bed and breakfast nearby.
Hey, remember when we used to stop here on the drive up? We haven't booked a room here in a while. How about we try that?
Mom quickly responded, "That sounds like fun. Let's do that.